Chapter 24. Dark Night of the Soul. White. Everything was white. Not the warm, amber white of the underground. Not the clinical white of Principal Voss's office. Not the soft, peach-adjacent white of a lustre morning, or the cold, surgical white of the valuation arch. This was the white of nothing. The white of a page before someone writes on it. The white of a system that has finished erasing everything and is waiting patiently for the blank space to be refilled. I floated in it, or stood or lay. The distinction didn't exist here because direction didn't exist here. There was no up, no down, no forward, no back, just the white. And me. Whatever me meant now. A pattern, a signal, a consciousness that used to be a boy and was now a component of a machine that was using his dissolved essence to power a genocide. The de-resolution field was gone, not depleted, absorbed. The seed had integrated it so completely that I couldn't feel the boundary between my power and the system's architecture. The I am here, that had been my centre, my warmth, my weapon, myself, it was still present. But it was no longer mine. It belonged to the reboot wave. It was the reboot wave. My refusal to be nothing had been converted into the force that was making 4,000 people into nothing. The cruelest irony the universe had ever designed. I tried to think, tried to be, but being required a framework, a context, a body, a world to exist in, and the white had no framework. It was the space between the old system and the new one, the gap between deletion and recreation. The moment of held breath between the exhale of everything that was and the inhale of everything that would be. I was nowhere. I was nothing. I was the zero I'd always been told I was, and for the first time, the system was right. Time passed, or didn't, without the pulse marking seconds, and without Cale's mechanical clock, and without even the biological rhythm of a heartbeat, because I didn't have a heart anymore. Not here, not in the white. Time was a suggestion that the universe had stopped making. I thought about Etta, about her last words. Fragments scattered across the dissolution like seed pods in a wind. The pinky curl. The things the system can't see. The things too small to index. The things that are real precisely because they have no value. The first line. Find the first line. I turned the fragments over. Not with hands, not with a mind exactly. With whatever was left of me in the white. The residue of Silas Thorne. The ghost of a ghost. The echo after the sound. The things the system can't see. The pulse saw everything. That was its fundamental design principle. Total observation. Total data collection. Total comprehension. Every heartbeat, every blink, every micro-expression, every dream. It saw Jax Miller's 9.9 and Lena Park's 8.7, and the synchronized applause and the friendship matches, and the ambient scent blends, and the optimized meals. It saw the data, and it processed the data, and it converted the data into power. But it hadn't seen me. For 15 years, the most powerful observation system in human history had looked at Silas Thorne and seen nothing. Not because I was invisible, not because I was hiding, because the thing that I was, the de-resolution carrier, the kill switch, the anomaly, existed beneath the system's threshold of perception. I wasn't invisible. I was beneath the resolution. Too small, too quiet, too zero value to register on the instruments designed to measure human worth. The pinky curl, my mother's left pinky, curling when she concentrated. A behaviour so small, so involuntary, so utterly devoid of social or data value that the pulse's monitoring systems, which tracked every macro expression, every social interaction, every engagement event, had never flagged it. Not because they couldn't detect it, because it didn't generate data. It didn't contribute to the engagement metrics. It didn't power anything. It was in the pulse's framework, noise, background static, the meaningless residue of a biological system that hadn't been fully optimized. Except it wasn't meaningless. It was the most real thing about her. the thing the clone couldn't replicate because the clone was built from data, and the pinky curl lived beneath data, in the space where a person existed not as a profile, but as a body, an animal, a collection of involuntary habits and unconscious gestures and purposeless micro-behaviors that added up to the thing called being alive and couldn't be captured in any database because being alive wasn't a data point. It was a state, like the core was a state, like the white was a state, like being 15 and invisible and drowning in a cafeteria while the kiosk stared through you was a state that no algorithm could quantify because the algorithm only measured what the algorithm was designed to measure, and no one had ever designed an algorithm to measure the specific, private, incalculable weight of being unseen. The things that are real precisely because they have no value. I was a zero. I'd always been a zero. The system had looked at me and assigned me the number that meant nothing. No social output, no engagement data, no contribution to the power grid. And that number, that zero, wasn't a failure of the system. It was a description, a true, accurate, complete description of what I was. I was the thing that had no value. And the thing that had no value was the thing the system couldn't see. And the thing the system couldn't see was the thing the system couldn't control. The thought arrived not as a revelation, but as a remembering, the way you remember your own name after waking from a dream that made you someone else. Not new information, old information, seen from a new angle. The truth I'd known since the first morning at the cafeteria kiosk, buried under 15 years of wanting to be something the system recognized. And finally, here, in the white, in the nothing, at the absolute bottom of the absolute worst moment of my entire existence, finally understood. Being unindexed wasn't my flaw. Being unindexed was my nature. The de-resolution trait didn't make me invisible as a side effect. Invisibility was the trait. The kill switch worked by being undetectable. The key worked by being too small for the lock to see. The weapon worked by existing beneath the threshold of the system's perception, in the zero value space where the algorithm didn't look because looking cost resources and zeros generated no return on the investment of attention. I was not a weapon that happened to be invisible. I was invisibility that happened to be a weapon. And right now, integrated into the seed, absorbed by the reboot wave, my de-resolution field woven into the system's architecture. The pulse thought it had consumed me, thought it had taken my power and made it its own, thought the key was in the lock and the door was opening, and the reboot was proceeding as modelled. But the pulse was measuring me the way it measured everything, by my output, by the de-resolution energy I was producing, by the data I was generating, by the value I was contributing to the reboot cycle. It wasn't measuring the part of me that had no value. It wasn't measuring the zero, the white pressed, the nothing hummed. And deep inside the machine that had eaten me, in the space where Silas Thorne's consciousness had been reduced to a residue too small for the system to track, something stirred. Not the de-resolution field, that was gone, absorbed, integrated, part of the machine now, powering the wave, serving the reboot. Not the third frequency, not the fourth, not any of the powers I discovered and developed and used across the desperate, impossible days since falling through the floor. All of those were abilities, functions, things the system could detect because they produced output, and things that produced output were things the system could consume. What stirred was something else, something that wasn't a power, something that had no function, something that produced no output and generated no data and contributed nothing to any metric the pulse had ever devised. The spirals, the tight black spirals I drew in the margins of my data pad when the feelings got too heavy. The drain for the scream, the zero value behavior that the clone could execute but couldn't need. The thing I did not because it was useful, but because I was drowning, and the spiral gave the drowning somewhere to go. The spirals weren't a power, they weren't a weapon, they weren't a function or an ability, or a trait embedded in my genetics by a brilliant engineer 73 years ago. They were me, the useless, valueless, unindexable, immeasurable me. The part that existed not because it served a purpose, but because existence doesn't require a purpose. The part that was real precisely because it had no value. The part the system had never seen because the system only saw what the system could use. I drew a spiral, not on a data pad, not with a hand, not with any physical or digital instrument. I drew it with my consciousness, the residue of Silas Thorne, the echo's echo, the zero inside the zero. I drew it in the white, the way you draw a breath when you've been held underwater. Not a choice, a reflex, the most fundamental, involuntary, zero-value act of a being that exists and cannot stop existing, because existence is not a function and cannot be turned off by a system that only controls functions. The spiral formed, black on white, a tiny, tight, purposeless mark in the infinite blank of the reboot's held breath. The system didn't see it. The pulse, vast, dying, consuming, triumphant, was focused on the de-resolution field, on the reboot wave, on the 10 million people it was saving, and the 4,000 people it was erasing, and the dome it was sustaining, and the architecture it was rebuilding. It was processing at maximum capacity. Every resource allocated, every sensor engaged, every algorithm running. And in the margins of all that processing, beneath the threshold of all that attention, a boy was drawing spirals in the dark. The first spiral was nothing, literally. A zero-value mark in a zero-value space, producing zero data, zero output, zero contribution to any system. But the second spiral was less nothing. Because the act of drawing, the act of existing in a way the system didn't measure, was in itself a kind of presence. Not the I am here of the de-resolution field. Something quieter, something that didn't announce itself, something that simply was, the way a heartbeat simply is, the way a pinky curls simply because the muscles know how, and the body does what bodies do when nobody's watching. The third spiral was a pulse, tiny, below the system's threshold, but mine, not the seeds, not the reboots, not the de-resolution field that the machine had eaten. A frequency that belonged to the part of me that had no value and therefore could not be consumed, because you can't eat what you can't see, and you can't see what has no value, and you can't assign value to the act of drawing spirals in the dark when you're drowning. The fourth spiral was a heartbeat. Not a metaphorical heartbeat, not a poetic gesture, a heartbeat, my heartbeat, the one I'd heard for the first time when I fell through the floor, and the pulse's ambient hum went silent. The rhythm that had been with me before the system, and would be with me after it. The biological, chemical, electrical fact of a heart contracting and expanding, not because an algorithm told it to, but because that's what hearts do. Because existence is not a feature that can be turned off. Because I am here is not a power, it's a condition. And conditions don't need permission. The white flickered, not much, a tremor, a stutter in the perfect blankness. The reboot wave, still expanding, still consuming, still powered by my absorbed de-resolution field, continued its outward march. But the white at its centre, the nothing at its core, the space where I was supposed to be zero and stay zero, that space was no longer zero. It was 0 point something, some infinitesimal, sub-threshold, below-resolution quantity that the system's instruments registered as noise and discarded. But it was there, and it was growing, not fast, not dramatically, with the slow, patient, stubborn persistence of a heartbeat that has been beating since before the system was built, and intends to continue after the system is gone. I drew more spirals, each one a heartbeat a presence, each presence a tiny, zero-value disruption in the perfect nothing of the reboot's held breath. And something began to happen. The de-resolution field, the one the seed had absorbed, the one that was powering the reboot wave, began to remember. not functionally, not as a system process, in the way that a river remembers the shape of its bed, even when the bed has been paved over. The field had been integrated into the seed's architecture, but it hadn't been erased. It was still there, my code, my frequency, my DNA-level design, running inside the machine, wearing the machine's uniform, performing the machine's function. But the shape was still mine. The bed was still there, and the spirals, the purposeless, valueless, zero-output spirals, were water, flowing along the old channels, finding the old grooves, reminding the field what shape it used to be. I am here, I whispered, not to the system, not to the field, not to anyone, just to the white, to the nothing, to the space where a boy used to be and might, if the spirals kept flowing, and the heartbeat kept beating, and the zero kept being stubbornly, uselessly, magnificently present, might be again. The field stirred, not free, not reclaimed, not torn from the seed's grip in a dramatic burst of heroic power. Just stirred. A tremor, a twitch, the smallest possible movement of a muscle that has been held in a clenched fist and is beginning, atom by atom, fibre by fibre, to remember what it feels like to be open. The reboot wave continued. The system continued. The white continued. But inside the machine, beneath the threshold, below the resolution, in the zero-value space where the algorithm didn't look, Silas Thorne was drawing spirals, and the spirals were becoming a pulse, and the pulse was becoming a presence, and the presence was becoming something the pulse had encountered exactly 4 times before, and had never, in 73 years of total observation, been able to predict or prevent or understand. A surprise. The boy who had no value was discovering that having no value was the one thing the system couldn't take away, because you can't steal what you can't see, and you can't see what you've already decided is nothing, and nothing, real nothing, chosen nothing, the nothing that isn't an absence but a presence so quiet the instruments can't hear it, is the most powerful thing in a world that runs on noise. The white flickered again, harder this time. The reboot wave faltered, not stopped, not reversed, faltered, a stutter in the expansion, a moment of uncertainty in a system that had eliminated uncertainty from its operational vocabulary 73 years ago. The pulse, for the first time in its existence, felt something it had no model for. Not the de-resolution field, not the third frequency, not the fourth. A heartbeat, a spiral, a boy in the margins, drawing in the dark, existing for no reason at all, except the stubborn, useless, zero-value fact that he existed. And the machine, vast, dying, triumphant, all-seeing, looked at the nothing in its centre and thought, "What is that?" And the nothing answered, "Me." And the machine didn't understand, because understanding requires value, and value requires data, and data requires measurement. And some things, the pinky curl, the spiral, the heartbeat, the boy, can't be measured. They can only be real. The white cracked.